One of the longest running series in video games history. Matter of fact, I would even say one of the longest running series in media history, because there's a lot of them. Dating all the way back to 1987, Final Fantasy. These games are pretty special to me. Not only are these games usually pretty easy to pick up and play, but they're also really fun to master. And as someone who has grown up in this modern era of multiplayer shooters, battle royales, and looter shooters that are all pretty much largely the same in concept and pretty much all play the same as well, Final Fantasy games are a nice and fun way to break the mold. Not only are all these games fun to play, but they also have captivating stories, depth, and each have a massive world to explore in. Each game is set in a different universe, however. There's going to be some major changes between each iteration of the series. So what better way to start these set of reviews with Final Fantasy 1, the one that started it all. Before that though, I feel like it's necessary to tell you which version of the game I chose to play, as well as such, what the differences between each version is. This is something I went back and forth on. I originally started on the PlayStation 1 version with Final Fantasy Origins and well, it didn't go great for me. The encounter rate was so massive that I kinda got a headache heading into one of the earlier dungeons of the game, and this is something I kinda wanted to get across. This game is not easy. The original NES version had a huge encounter rate. The PlayStation 1 has a huge encounter rate. And the iOS and PSP version have a slightly less encounter rate, I believe, but the game itself is a bit easier. There's also some major changes made with the PlayStation Portable and iOS versions, and Android, I'm guessing. I didn't really write Android in the script, but we're putting it in there now. Mainly with how magic works. In older versions of the game, you're limited to how many spells you can use. So let's say you have 5 level 1 spells you can use. You can use Kier 5 times, and then you either have to go to an inn or use a cottage to get your spell charges back. In the newer versions, they use the MP system, which is used mostly throughout the rest of the series of games. They also add ethers, which means you can replenish magic whenever you need to. If you want the most accessible vanilla experience, I would go with the PlayStation 1 version, as the original is a little bit buggy. As for me, I don't want to pull out my hair, so I went with the PlayStation Portable version. Also, I emulated it, so I can fast forward time, making the game considerably shorter, which I actually do recommend in this case. Though please support the developers, not that Square Enix really needs it, especially with their milking of a certain Final Fantasy game that is now basically its own franchise. I did buy the game on my phone to trick myself into thinking I'm not a horrible person for doing so. So you start off Final Fantasy, not with preset names, but you can name these characters anything you want, as long as you have enough characters to fit them in. You can also choose your own classes. The Fighter, which is essentially your standard sword-wielding, armor-wearing soldier. The Black Belt, who punches everything and essentially breaks this game's difficulty. The Red Mage, which is essentially a jack of all trades, but not a master at anything. The White Mage uses white magic and healing magic. The Black Mage uses black magic and damage magic. The Thief is well, he's pretty much useless. Okay, he can run away faster, and honestly, it might be worth it in the early game just to survive. But man, that is a stupid idea for a class. Make your characters, get a little mini cinematic, and you're plopped down on the world map. You talk to the king, and he says, "Save my daughter." Off you go, and you'll probably hit a random encounter. The combat in this game is pretty straightforward. You take turns attacking till you or the enemies are defeated. It's a pretty vanilla experience, and honestly, I feel like that is what you would expect from the very first Final Fantasy game that was released in 1987. But I would still say it's impressive for its time. How many open world games with a free roaming map was around back then? That's both me praising it and actually asking because I wasn't around. But I can't imagine there was very many games this big. You gain experience, you level up, that increases your spell charges or MP, as well as your stats and HP, all pretty standard stuff. So you defeat Garland, who stole the princess, you're instantly back with the king, and he essentially says, "You're the Warriors of Light. Save our world. Let me finish the bridge." The princess gives you a loot, and you're off. So I don't really want to go into many spoilers of the stories in my reviews, but there isn't really much of a story here. There is one moment, and I won't spoil that moment if you're going to play this game. But essentially, you're the 4 Warriors of Light. You need to go around collecting the 4 elemental crystals. You go to each town, and once you're done with the town, that's essentially it. You'll never really need to see them ever again. You can always go back there, and you can rebuy the weapons and armor that you didn't get the first time, or maybe there's some magic spells that you weren't leveled up enough to get. You can always go back and get those, but more often than not, the story does not require same town twice. Throughout the adventure, you gain stuff like a ship to travel on the ocean. a canoe to travel on rivers and lakes, and later in the game, you unlock an airship, which is one of the most aggravating things with this game. The airship starts in the desert, but you can't land on sand or forest, and can only land on plain light green grass, which by the time you will get it, most of the areas you'll need to go to require a long travel with some of the toughest enemies in the game showing up. That is, if you know where you're going. Apart from the first hour or maybe 2 hours of this game, there really isn't any indication of where you need to go. And where you usually need to go requires a lot of backtracking to grab an item to give to somebody else. The biggest offender of this comes about a third of the way through, where you kill a boss, grab a ruby, give it to a rock man for some reason, just to learn you have to go back through the same dungeon to get to the actual boss. Mix this with the incredibly high encounter rate and this game becomes a Titus. I actually spelled Titus in the script, nice. Mix this with the incredibly high encounter rate and this game becomes a tedious journey of asking yourself where you need to go and dying a lot because almost every enemy applies the poison status effect, at least early on. I mean it too. The Marsh Cave, which is one of the earliest dungeons in this game, is just filled with enemies that will poison you. Make sure you buy a lot of antidotes. And when you can, buy the teleport magic, so you can just hop right out of the dungeon when you need to. This gameplay doesn't really change till later in the game when you get a class buff, essentially giving access to higher magic and more weapons. Unless you have a monk, then you don't really get any upgrade at all. Honestly, this upgrade when it comes to stats isn't really worth it, but man, it looks pretty cool to see your character look bigger. Even how you get it, it's extremely cool. It's the best cosmetic upgrade ever. And you use it for like an hour. Yeah, it comes near the very end of the game. And that's pretty much it for the basic Final Fantasy game. Now, if you have the PlayStation Portable Edition, there are some extra dungeons and content to go through that is miles more difficult than the rest of the bosses in the game. There is even a huge long puzzle to get to the toughest boss of the game. Though I got a huge problem with this. See, there is a time limit on all these, and when you fail, you begin to take damage. You would think that the best thing is to restart the dungeon, which you can do, and actually beat it within the time limit, but the game actually punishes you if you do it within the time. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. It's also randomly generated. If you want to do this, go for it, but I decided against it. The only thing remaining to talk about is the presentation. The look of this game is really nice, especially on later versions of the game. Obviously the NES version will look very primitive compared to later versions, but some about sprites really aged well. Way better than the PlayStation 1 3D models at least. The PlayStation Portable version of the game is gorgeous though, even has shadows and light rays moving across the town. It's great, man. The soundtrack as well is mostly good. I love the battle theme when I first heard it, but I will say towards the end of the game I was for sure done with it. Didn't stop me from chanting it throughout the playthrough though. The problem with the soundtrack isn't that it's bad, because it's not, it's great. There's just not many songs. You're gonna hear the same 5 songs over and over again on a loop. It gets a little repetitive. Obviously this is because it's the first game of the series, but it is something that is very noticeable in modern times. That's basically it with the very first Final Fantasy game. It is pretty vanilla, but that is to be expected. If you got some time and you want to play where the series started, it's not a horrible thing to pick up and play, but the use of the series really shows, especially compared to later games. After all that, I'm going to give it a 6.7 out of 10, which may seem low, but keep in mind, this is the first in a really long and legendary franchise. It can't quite compare it with later games in the series, so being that high is saying a lot. This is the game that started it all. There are currently 15 sequels to this game, about to be 16 sequels in this game. There are numerous remakes of this game as well as other games later in the series, and multiple spin-offs. At the time of this writing, there are currently 103 properties of Final Fantasy games out there, and that's not including the 5 or 6 times that Disney used the property. Yes, the first one is primitive compared to the other games, but that's how it's gonna be. The fact that it's this good should show you how legendary this series actually is. Well, that's it for the Final Fantasy 1 review. Stay subscribed though. I will eventually be doing a playthrough and a review of Final Fantasy 2 on the channel, and we'll be going through the series in order, skipping one in particular that I'm saving for last because I know it's the biggest one. If other Final Fantasies are your thing though, take a look at the channel. I have plenty of other Final Fantasy games I've already done a playthrough of. I've done a playthrough of Final Fantasy 3. We have videos on Final Fantasy 5. I did a playthrough on Final Fantasy 6. I did a playthrough of Crisis Core, and I did multiple playthroughs of the Final Fantasy 7 remake. For more reviews, feel free to check the channel as well. I've done multiple reviews in the past, and I plan on doing a couple more of these reviews in the future because I do kind of like doing reviews, and I feel like this one was pretty fun to work on, probably because I didn't feel pressure to get it out very quickly right after the game came out. Thank you for watching. Like the video if you haven't already, subscribe for more content, comment down below, and check the description for links such as the Discord.